The day Adelaide Lockhart rolled into Harlan Creek with nothing but a wagon full of fabric bolts, a battered sewing machine, and a determination that could have cut glass. Not a single soul in that sun-baked Texas town could have predicted that her arrival would unravel the carefully stitched-together loneliness of the most stubborn cowboy in the county. It was the spring of 1878, and Harlan Creek sat like a dusty jewel in the bend of the Brazos River, a town of maybe 400 souls scratching out their lives between cattle drives and dry seasons. The main street boasted a general store owned by the Prute family, a saloon called the Golden Spur, a bank that had been robbed twice in 3 years, a modest church, a schoolhouse, and a livery stable that smelled of old hay and horse sweat. What Harlan Creek did not have, until that particular Tuesday in April, was a seamstress worth her salt. Adelaide was 24 years old. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned back under a wide-brimmed bonnet, gray eyes that caught the light like river stones after rain, and hands that were quick and sure in everything they did. She had come from San Antonio, where she had spent 4 years apprenticing under a formidable German woman named Mrs. Baumann, learning not just the cut and stitch of fabric, but the deeper art of understanding what a person needed when they came through the door asking for something to wear. She had saved enough money to lease a small storefront on the eastern end of Main Street, and she arrived with a plan, a little capital, and absolutely no illusions about how difficult the next few months would be. The wagon pulled up in front of the empty shop, and Adelaide climbed down without waiting for help, which drew a few stares from the men loitering near the saloon across the street. She was not unfriendly, but she was not the sort of woman who made a performance of her arrival either. She simply began unloading, moving bolts of cotton and wool and a careful bundle of linen with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned that waiting for help often meant waiting forever. Mrs. Eleanor Prute, the storekeeper's wife and the unofficial social coordinator of Harlan Creek, appeared within 10 minutes. She was a round, warm woman of about 50 with silver-streaked hair and an expression of perpetual curiosity. "You must be the one who wrote to Mayor Daniels about the lease," Eleanor said, tilting her head at the sign Adelaide was already attempting to hang above the door. It read in clean, painted letters, "Adelaide Lockhart, Seamstress and Alterations." "That's right," Adelaide said, steadying the sign with one hand while she adjusted the nail with the other. "Do you have a hammer I might borrow?" Eleanor laughed, a genuine sound, and went back to her husband's store, returning 3 minutes later with a hammer, a young boy to hold the ladder, and an invitation to supper that Adelaide accepted with real gratitude. By the end of that first week, Adelaide had unpacked every bolt of fabric, arranged her sewing machine in the front window where the light was best, pinned a small card in the window listing her prices, and introduced herself to most of the women in town, who were, without exception, deeply glad she had come. The last seamstress in Harlan Creek, a woman named Dottie Crane, had retired and moved to live with her daughter in Fort Worth the previous autumn, and in the months since, the women of the town had been making do with mail-order patterns and uneven hems and the persistent frustration of dresses that never quite fit the way they were meant to. Adelaide was good at her work. She was very good. Within 2 weeks, she had mended a wedding dress that had been accidentally torn during a barn dance, let out the waist of 3 skirts for a woman named Pearl who was expecting her 4th child, and taken in the sleeves of the town doctor's Sunday coat, which had always been too long for his arms. She worked from 7 in the morning until the light failed in the evening, and she did it with a quiet focus that earned her a particular kind of respect in a town where honest labor was the primary currency of dignity. It was on the 14th day of her residency in Harlan Creek that Cecil Underwood walked through her door for the first time. He was tall, the kind of tall that required a slight duck under door frames, broad through the shoulders, and brown from years under the open sky. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and a jaw that seemed perpetually set, not in anger exactly, but in the particular expression of a man accustomed to making decisions and living with them. His eyes were a deep, steady brown, the color of creek water in late summer, and when they landed on Adelaide standing behind her counter with a half-finished skirt in her hands, they held a moment of surprise quickly covered by a neutral pleasantness. He was 28 years old. He had run the Underwood Ranch, 500 acres of grass and cattle land 3 miles south of town, since his father had died of a chest illness 4 years prior, leaving Cecil the land, a modest debt, 2 aging ranch hands, and the particular loneliness that comes from being the only person responsible for everything. He held in his arms a bundle of shirts. There were 7 of them, and they were in varying states of distress. 2 had buttons missing. 1 had a torn collar. 2 more had split seams along the shoulders, likely from years of hard work and the particular strain of a man built like Cecil, attempting to fit into shirts that had been made for someone less substantial. 1 had a frayed cuff, and the last one was simply stained in a way that Adelaide could not immediately identify but recognized as the particular optimism of someone bringing a shirt to a seamstress and hoping for a small miracle. "Morning," he said. His voice was low, not unkind, carrying the measured quality of a man who chose his words with the same carefulness he'd choose a trail. "Good morning," Adelaide said. She set down the skirt and looked at the pile in his arms. "I see you've brought some work for me." He set the shirts on the counter with a sort of careful deliberateness, as though he had rehearsed this. "Elena Prout said you do mending." "I do," Adelaide said. She began lifting the shirts one by one, examining them with the efficient, unsentimental gaze of a professional. "Missing buttons on these 2, torn collar here, split seams on these and these." She held up the last one. "This one I can attempt, but I cannot promise miracles with set-in staining." He nodded. "I figured it was worth trying." "When do you need them?" He looked slightly uncertain, as though he hadn't thought past the act of bringing them. "No particular rush." "Whenever you can manage it." Adelaide wrote his name in her ledger in a neat hand, counted the shirts, and gave him a ticket. "Come back in a week. They'll be ready." He took the ticket, looked at it for a moment, and then looked at her in a way that was not impolite but was definitely the look of a man who had not previously considered what a person like Adelaide Lockhart might be doing in a town like Harlan Creek. "You came from San Antonio," he said. She raised an eyebrow slightly. "News traveled fast here." "I did." "Long way to come," he said. "It is," she agreed. She waited, not unkindly, for him to say something further or to leave. He seemed to recognize that the conversation had reached a natural conclusion, touched the brim of his hat, and left. Adelaide looked at the pile of shirts. She had a feeling, small and instinctive, like the first thread pulled from a complicated tangle, that this was not the last she would see of Cecil Underwood. She was not wrong. He came back for the shirts exactly 1 week later, on a Friday afternoon when the light through the shop window was golden and thick with the smell of turned earth from the fields beyond town. Adelaide had all 7 shirts folded neatly on the counter, each one mended with the kind of quiet competence that she hoped would speak for itself without need for advertisement. Cecil picked up the first shirt, the one with the torn collar, and looked at it with an attention that Adelaide found herself watching. He turned it over, ran his thumb along the collar seam, and something in his expression shifted very slightly toward what she thought might be appreciation, though he kept it contained. "This is good work," he said, and it sounded, coming from him, like a considered statement rather than a polite pleasantry, which Adelaide appreciated more than she might have expected. "Thank you," she said. "The shoulder seams on those 2 will hold much better now. I reinforced them with a double stitch." He nodded and began to pay, and then paused, still looking at the shirts. A moment passed that Adelaide could not entirely account for, a sort of hesitation that seemed to come from somewhere specific, though she could not tell where. "I have another shirt," he said. "At home, it's worse than these." Adelaide looked at him. "Bring it in," she said. "I will," he said, and then he gathered his shirts, touched his hat again, and left. Elena Prout came in the next morning for the alteration she had commissioned and told Adelaide. with the cheerful frankness of a woman who considered information a form of currency, that Cecil Underwood was the most eligible bachelor in Harlan Creek, and also, in her considered opinion, the most impossible one. "He runs that ranch like it's the only thing in the world," Eleanor said, watching Adelaide pin the hem of her new dress. "His mother died when he was young. His father worked himself into the grave. Cecil took it all over, and he's done well by it, truly. The man is one of the hardest working people I have ever known. But he is alone out there, and I do not think he knows what to do about it." "Perhaps he's content," Adelaide said mildly, pins between her lips. Eleanor made a sound that was not agreement. A man like Cecil Underwood was not made for contentment. He was made for something. He just hasn't found it yet. Adelaide did not respond to this in any particular way, but she thought about it later, in the quiet of the evening when she was sitting in the back of her shop where she had set up a small living area, a narrow bed, a washstand, a small iron stove. She thought about what it meant to be made for something, and whether she herself had found it yet, or whether the shop and the fabric and the careful work of her hands was the thing she was made for, or whether it was something she was moving toward, like a trail that wound around a hill before revealing what lay on the other side. Cecil came back with the other shirt 4 days later. It was, as he had said, worse than the others. The left sleeve was torn nearly from the body, and the fabric along the side seam was frayed in a way that suggested it had been mended before, badly, with thread that didn't match and stitches that were too wide and too irregular to hold. "Was this mended previously?" Adelaide asked. He looked slightly abashed. "I attempted it myself." She studied the shirt. "How?" "A needle and some thread," he said, "and, I admit, a great deal of optimism." The corner of Adelaide's mouth moved upward involuntarily. She caught it and pressed it back down, but she suspected he had seen it. "I can save it," she said. "The fabric is still good. I'll have to take the sleeve off entirely and reattach it, but it will hold." "Is that much work?" he said. "It is," she said honestly, "but it's worth doing. Fabric like this is hard to replace." He seemed to weigh this. "All right," he said. "I appreciate it." He lingered a moment longer than the transaction required, and Adelaide found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not entirely object to his lingering, though she had neither the time nor the inclination to examine why. "How are you finding Harlan Creek?" he asked. It was the kind of question that held more genuine interest than its surface suggested. "Busy," she said, which was true. "The women here have been very kind." "The women here," he repeated, as though noting the specific nature of her observation. "The town generally has been welcoming," she amended, with a faint note of amusement she made no great effort to hide. "I should have come to welcome you when you arrived," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that sounded like a real admission, not a pleasantry. "I was in the middle of a calving situation that required attention." "Calving," she said. "Spring," he said, as though this explained everything, which in Harlan Creek she was beginning to understand it did. "You're forgiven," she said lightly, and then immediately wondered if that was too forward for a woman she had just met this man twice professionally. But he smiled at it, a real smile, brief and warm, like a window opened in an otherwise closed house, and something in Adelaide shifted in a way she would spend the next several days trying to categorize. He came back for the repaired shirt. He thanked her. He paid her. And then, 3 days after that, he came back with 2 more shirts. Now Adelaide was a practical woman. She examined the shirts. One had a button missing, easily fixed in 20 minutes. The other was in perfectly fine condition. She turned it over in her hands looking for the defect and found none. She looked at Cecil Underwood. He met her gaze with an expression of almost heroic blankness. "This one seems to be in good repair," she said, keeping her voice very neutral. "The collar," he said with great conviction. Adelaide looked at the collar. The collar was pristine. "I see," she said. She wrote it in her ledger. She took both shirts. She did not smile. He did not smile either, but there was something around the edges of his composure that suggested he was working hard to maintain it. That was the 3rd visit. There were, over the following 6 weeks, 8 more. The shirts became a kind of language between them, each visit an occasion for conversation that grew longer and more genuine with each exchange. He told her about the ranch, about the 200 head of longhorns he was running, about the difficulties of the dry spring and his concerns about the summer water supply. She told him about her years learning under Mrs. Bauman, about the satisfaction of making something that fit a person properly, the small but real pleasure of watching someone leave the shop, standing a little straighter than when they had come in. He had opinions about things, which she appreciated, because the men she had known before tended either to have no opinions or to have them loudly, and without much thought behind them. Cecil's opinions came from somewhere considered and specific, a position arrived at through observation, experience, and the long habit of being alone with his thoughts on horseback across a large piece of land. He thought the new railroad spur being discussed for the county would change the cattle business more than anyone was yet acknowledging. He thought the county sheriff, a man named Hargrove, was doing his best, but was outpaced by the problems growing up along the river road. He thought the spring grass this year, despite the dry stretch, was better than it had been in 3 seasons. Adelaide found that she looked forward to Tuesdays and Fridays, which were when he most often came in. She told herself this was because he was a reliable and paying customer in a business that was still establishing itself. This was true. It was not the whole truth, and somewhere around the 4th week of his visits, she stopped pretending to herself that it was. She saw how he was in town generally, in the peripheral way that a woman who spends most of her time in a storefront on Main Street sees everything that passes. He was courteous without being glad-handing about it, the kind of man who held the door of the post office and who carried groceries to the wagon for Mrs. Alvarez, the Mexican widow who lived at the edge of town, and whom some of the less thoughtful residents of Harlan Creek had not always treated with the dignity she deserved. Adelaide noted this specifically and with particular approval. She also noted, on a Thursday when she had cause to walk past the livery stable, that Cecil was deep in conversation with Tom Alvarez, the widow's teenage son, who worked part-time at the stable and was, according to a leaner, hoping to save enough to attend school in Waco. Cecil was explaining something about the mechanics of a wagon wheel with a patience and seriousness that suggested he was treating the boy's interest as entirely legitimate, which, given the casual dismissiveness with which some of the ranching men treated anyone not of their particular world, said something about him. She thought about this later, the way small moments reveal the interior of a person in ways that long conversation cannot always accomplish. It was at the 5th visit, a Tuesday morning in late May, that the conversation between them crossed some invisible line and became something else. He had come in with 2 shirts, both of which Adelaide suspected had been deliberately damaged, though she had no proof and chose not to press the point. While she was examining them, he said, without particular preamble, "I wanted to ask if you might like to take a walk on Sunday afternoon." Adelaide went still in the way that a person goes still when they have been expecting something, and yet find themselves surprised by its arrival. She set the shirts down. She looked at him. His expression was steady, though she thought she detected in the set of his jaw something that was not his usual composure, but was rather the particular tension of a man who has said the thing, and is now waiting in the full knowledge that waiting is all he can do. "A walk," she said. "There's a path along the creek," he said, "north of town. It's pleasant in the late afternoon. I thought you might not have had the occasion to see much of the country around Harlan Creek, being that you've been working since the day you arrived." This was perceptive of him and accurate. She had barely been past Main Street in 6 weeks. "I would like that," she said. She said it simply because she was not a woman who found coyness useful and because it was true. His whole posture seemed to alter in some subtle way, not dramatically, but as though something had shifted underneath the surface. "Sunday, then, I'll come by at 3. She went back to the shirts. He went to the door. He paused. "For what it's worth," he said, with his hand on the door frame and his back still partially to her, The shirts are not all strictly in need of mending." She did not look up from the counter. "I know," she said. There was a pause, and then a sound she had never quite heard from him before. A low, warm laugh, brief and genuine, that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. And then he was gone, and she was standing in her shop with 2 shirts in her hands, and a feeling in her chest that she recognized from her reading of novels, and the accounts of older women who had attempted to explain such things to her. A feeling that was warm and unsettling and entirely inconvenient, and also, quite specifically, wonderful. Sunday came. He appeared at 3 o'clock in a clean white shirt that she had, in fact, genuinely mended, the collar one, and a pair of dark trousers and his good hat. And she could tell he had given the hat a brushing, because it no longer wore the layer of trail dust that characterized most of his appearances on weekdays. She had put on her blue dress, the better one, the one she had sewn herself from a bolt of cornflower blue cotton she had brought from San Antonio, fitted properly through the shoulders and waist in the way that her work clothes never quite were, because a seamstress, she had found, rarely sewed for herself with the same attention she devoted to her clients. He looked at her when she came out of the shop, and his expression moved through several things very quickly before settling into something warm and careful and a little helpless, and Adelaide understood it without requiring it to be explained. They walked north along the creek path, and the afternoon was the kind that the Texas spring produces occasionally, relenting from the heat, with a good breeze off the water and the cottonwoods moving along the bank and the sky an enormous, generous blue above them. They talked for 2 hours. They talked about his father, whom he described with the complex honesty of a person who loved someone and also understood their faults. They talked about Adelaide's family, her mother who had died when she was 16, her father who was a printer in Galveston and who had, with more generosity than she had always recognized at the time, let her go to San Antonio to learn a trade when she could have stayed and kept house for him. They talked about what they wanted, in the way that 2 people do when they are in the early stage of wanting each other, and using larger subjects to approach the specific one. He asked her if she intended to stay in Harlan Creek. She said she intended to make a go of it. He said he hoped she would. The way he said it made it clear that his hope was not entirely professional. When he walked her back to the door of her shop as the evening came on, he stood for a moment in that particular way of a man who is calculating the distance between where he is and where he wishes to be. "I'd like to take you to supper at Mrs. Holt's boarding house," he said. "Friday evening." "Mrs. Holt's has a dining room," Adelaide said. "She sets a table on Fridays for people who aren't boarding there," he said. "Chicken and gravy, usually. It's the best cooking in town." "Friday then," Adelaide said. She went inside. She leaned against the door after it closed and pressed her hands against her face and breathed for a moment. Because she was a practical woman of 24 who had built a business and crossed 150 miles on her own judgment, and she was not, she told herself firmly, going to lose her head over a cowboy. She then sat down and completed approximately half her usual evening work, because the other half of her concentration was entirely elsewhere, and she accepted this as the honest situation it was and went to bed earlier than usual. The Friday supper at Mrs. Holt's was followed by a Sunday walk, which was followed by another Friday supper, and then he appeared on a Wednesday with no shirt at all to mend, but with a question about whether she would like to attend the box social at the church hall the following Saturday. And she said yes, and he bid at the social for her box lunch with a kind of serene determination that suggested he had thought this through in advance and was prepared to bid considerably higher than he did. Which turned out to be unnecessary because Harlan Creek had largely already drawn its own conclusions about Cecil Underwood and his visits to the seamstress shop, and the other bidders gave way with the cheerful deference of people in a small town who find other people's courtship a source of general delight. They sat under the oak tree at the edge of the churchyard and ate cold chicken and cornbread and pie, and it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and Adelaide was happier than she had been in a long time. There were complications, of course, because life is made of complications, and the Wild West did not especially believe in smooth roads. The first complication was a man named Roland Vickers, who ran a competing dry goods operation from a wagon that made a circuit of the ranches in the county, and who had, in the weeks following Adelaide's arrival, taken a personal interest in her that she had not encouraged, and that he was slow to accept as unenthused. He was not a dangerous man, but he was a persistent one, and he appeared at her shop on 3 separate occasions with gifts she had to decline, and with the particular confidence of a man who does not believe a woman alone in business can afford to have preferences. The second occasion of his appearance, which involved a bunch of wildflowers and an invitation to ride out to his camp for supper, was interrupted by the arrival of Cecil, who came through the door in his straightforward manner and took in the scene with the composed alertness of a man accustomed to reading situations. He said nothing aggressive. He simply stood there, steady and present, in the way that a fence post is present, immovable and clear in its purpose, and looked at Roland Vickers with the brown eyes that did not require anything as dramatic as a threat to communicate what they were communicating. Roland looked at Cecil, then at Adelaide, then at Cecil again. Then he put the flowers down on the counter, said something vague about the weather, and left. Adelaide waited until the door had closed. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Do what?" Cecil said with complete and transparent innocence. "Stand there looking like a boulder," she said. He appeared to consider this. "I came to ask if you'd seen my shirt," he said, "the gray one. I handed you the gray one 11 days ago." "So you did," he said thoughtfully. She looked at him, he looked at her. And then they were both laughing, quietly, because Roland Vickers was a minor inconvenience and the afternoon was good and the light through the shop window was warm, and it was the first time they had laughed together at something specific and shared, and it felt like a door opening. The second complication was more serious. In the middle of June, a letter arrived for Adelaide from her father in Galveston. He was not well. His chest, which had bothered him for a year, was now troubling him seriously enough that his doctor had advised him to slow his work at the printing press. He was not asking her to come back, he wrote, because he knew she had built something there, and he was not a man who asked for things easily, but she could read between the lines of his careful, printer's handwriting the loneliness of a man who was frightened and didn't know how to say so. She read the letter 3 times sitting in the back room of her shop, and then she sat very still for a while looking at the wall. She told Cecil about it on their walk that Sunday, not because she had decided to tell him, but because it came out in the way that things do when you are talking to someone who has made themselves a safe place for honesty. She told him about her father, about the printing shop, about the particular weight of being the only child of a man who had always been capable and was now becoming less so. Cecil listened in the way he had, complete and unhurried, and when she finished he said, "Do you need to go to him?" "I don't know," she said. "Not yet," he said, "not yet. But if you needed to," he said, "your shop would wait, and I would see to it that it waited." She looked at him. "You would?" "I'd ask a leaner to look after the space," he said, "and I'd write to you, if you wanted me to write to you." The sincerity in his voice was quiet and total, and it undid something in her that had been very carefully held together. She looked out at the creek for a moment, at the way the light fell across the water. "I would want you to write to me," she said. He nodded, as though this had been important to know, and they walked on. She wrote to her father that week, a long letter full of everything she could think to say, and included a bank draft for what she could spare. And she waited for his reply with the particular helpless anxiety of someone who understands that love and distance are in constant, irresolvable tension. The third complication arose from the direction she had least expected, which was the direction of the ranch itself. Cecil's more senior ranch hand, a weathered, taciturn man of about 55 named Donald Priest, who had worked for the Underwood family since before Cecil was born, made it his business to come into Adelaide's shop on a Wednesday morning in late June under the pretense of needing a button replaced on his working coat. Adelaide performed this service while Donal Priest sat on the customer chair and regarded her with the slightly sideways assessment of a man who was conducting a serious evaluation and wished to be discreet about it. "Cecil's a good man," Donal said eventually while she was threading a needle. "He seems to be," Adelaide agreed carefully. "Lost his mother young," Donal said. "His father was a hard man, not unkind but hard. Cecil took over the ranch when he was 24 years old with a debt against the property and no real help beyond me and young Hector. He's paid down nearly all of that debt in 4 years." Adelaide looked up from the needle. Donal was watching her directly now. "I'm telling you this," Donal said, "because he won't tell you himself, and because anyone who is going to be in his life ought to understand what he carries." "I understand," Adelaide said. She said it with a quietness that was not reassurance for Donal's sake, but was rather the sound of a woman telling the truth. Donal looked at her for a moment longer, and then something in his face relaxed, in the way a person's face relaxes when a long-standing concern resolves itself. "Buttons on tight, then," he said. "Very tight," she said. "It won't come off." "Good," he said. He paid her, buttoned his coat, and left without further comment on the matter of Cecil Underwood. And Adelaide thought that this was, in its rough way, the closest thing to a blessing she was likely to receive from that quarter, and she valued it accordingly. By July, Harlan Creek had formed its collective and affectionate opinion on the matter of Cecil Underwood and Adelaide Lockhart, and expressed it in the way small towns do, through a combination of encouraging smiles, pointed teasing, and the occasional well-meaning piece of unsolicited advice. Eleanor Prout told Adelaide she thought Cecil was going to propose before the summer was out. Adelaide told Eleanor she was being fanciful. Eleanor told her she was being deliberately obtuse, and that she, Eleanor, had known Cecil Underwood since he was 6 years old, and had never seen him take a step toward anything personal without having already decided it fully and completely, so the question was merely one of timing. Adelaide went back to her work and attempted not to think too much about this, with mixed success. The summer settled in with its full Texas heat, and the shop became a different kind of place in the afternoons, hot and close and smelling of fabric and the lavender water Adelaide used to iron the finer pieces. She had taken on a young girl of 17 named Nancy Shields as a part-time assistant, teaching her the basics of alterations so that she could handle the simpler repairs while Adelaide focused on the more complex commissions, which were beginning to come from women in the surrounding county who had heard about the quality of her work and were making the trip into Harlan Creek specifically to see her. She was building something real. She understood this with a clarity that was both satisfying and a little daunting. The shop was no longer a gamble. It was a fact. She was a part of Harlan Creek now in the specific way that only useful, competent people become part of a place, the kind of part that would leave a gap if it were removed. Cecil came in on a Tuesday in mid-July with a face that wore something different. He didn't have a shirt, which was, by this point, an entirely expected opening gambit that they had both stopped pretending was anything other than what it was, a reason to be in the same room. But the set of his expression held something that Adelaide recognized after a moment's consideration as news. "The Hartley brothers hit a cattle drive coming up from the south," he said. "3 ranchers, 1 man shot." Adelaide felt the cold of it despite the heat of the afternoon. The Hartley brothers were a pair of rustlers and opportunists who had been moving through the county for months, staying just ahead of whatever law was organized enough to pursue them. The county sheriff, Hargrove, had been trying to catch them since February. "How bad?" she said. "The man's alive," Cecil said. "But it's concerning. They're getting bolder." He paused. "They've been seen in the range south of my property twice in the last month." Adelaide looked at him steadily. "Are you worried?" "About my cattle some," he said. "About my men." He looked at her directly. "About you." "About me," she said. "I'm on Main Street." Main Street is not a fortress, he said quietly. She understood that he was not catastrophizing. He was a man who assessed things accurately and without drama, and if he was expressing concern, it was because the concern was proportional to the actual situation. I'm careful, she said. I lock the door at night. I know, he said. And then, after a pause that had a particular quality to it, like the still moment before a storm breaks, I've been thinking about that, about you being here alone. Adelaide waited. I've been thinking about it for a while, he said. He looked at the counter for a moment, then back at her. The brown eyes were very direct. I'm not skilled at saying things like this in the way that they ought to be said. I suspect you've noticed that. You've managed adequately, she said, keeping her voice light when the rest of her was very much not. Adelaide, he said. And the way he said her name, not Miss Lockhart but Adelaide, with a weight and a tenderness that he had clearly been saving up, made the lightness in her impossible to maintain. She waited. I would like you to be my wife, he said. It was not elaborate. It was not poetic. It was exactly as direct and honest as everything else about him. And it was, for exactly that reason, the most affecting thing anyone had ever said to her. She breathed once, carefully. You've given this serious thought, she said. Since March, he said. He paused. Since about the second week of March, she calculated. You came in for the first time in the second week of March. Yes, he said. Something in her chest came entirely undone. She pressed her hand flat against the counter for a moment. Cecil, she said, and she said his name the same way he had said hers, with the weight of everything she meant by it. Yes. He looked at her as if he had not entirely been certain of this outcome despite his conviction, and the relief in his face was the most human thing she had ever seen on him, raw and real, and quickly followed by something warmer and more permanent. Yes, she said again, because it was worth saying twice. He reached across the counter and took her hand, the one that was flat against the wood, and held it in his with the particular gentleness of a large man who has learned to be careful with small things. His hand was calloused and warm and entirely steady. I have a ring, he said. It was my mother's. It's a garnet. If you don't like it, I will get you something else. I will like it, she said with certainty, because she knew without seeing it that she would like anything that had belonged to his mother, that he had kept, that he was now choosing to give her. He produced it from his shirt pocket, a small, neat thing set in gold with a dark red stone that caught the afternoon light like a coal, and he put it on her finger with a serious, gentle attention that made the act feel like a vow before the vow. They stood on opposite sides of the seamstress counter in the shop on Main Street in Harlan Creek, Texas, in the summer of 1878, holding hands over the counter, and the afternoon went on around them without taking any particular notice of what had just happened, which was fine, because it was theirs. Eleanor Prout, who had come to the door to see if Adelaide had the bolt of cream-colored muslin she had inquired about, looked through the glass, saw the general nature of the scene, and withdrew with a satisfied smile, deciding that the muslin could wait until tomorrow. They were married in September, on a Saturday when the worst of the summer heat had finally broken, and the morning came in cool and clear with a sky that seemed to have been polished. The ceremony was at the church, which was small and white-painted and full of Harlan Creek on its best behavior, meaning most of the town had come, including Donal Priest in a clean shirt and an expression that was very nearly smiling, and young Tom Alvarez, who had been invited specifically by Cecil, and who sat with his mother in the third row looking pleased to be included. Adelaide wore the dress she had made herself for the occasion, an ivory cotton with a fitted bodice and a full skirt and small covered buttons from neck to waist, sewn in the quiet evenings of August while the shop was closed, and the heat had finally relented enough to make close work possible. It was the finest thing she had ever made, and she had made it with the understanding that she would wear it once and remember it always. She carried a small bunch of yellow wildflowers that Nancy had gathered that morning and tied with a piece of the green ribbon Adelaide had on a bolt near the window. Cecil stood at the altar and watched her come down the aisle with the same expression he had worn in the shop when she had come out in the blue dress on the first Sunday of their walks. That brief, helpless warmth quickly covered and held, except this time he let it stay on his face for longer, because there was no particular reason now to contain it. They said their vows to the Reverend Aldous Pike with the quiet conviction of two people who understood exactly what they were saying and intended every word of it. When he said, "I thee wed," she understood that she had traveled 150 miles and built a business and mended 11 shirts of varying degrees of legitimacy to arrive at this specific moment, and that all of it had been exactly right. Nancy threw rice as they came out of the church, an enthusiastic handful that hit Cecil directly in the hat, which made Adelaide laugh genuinely and freely for the first time in what felt like a very long time, and he looked at her laughing beside him in the September sunshine with an expression that was simply happiness, straightforward and unguarded and complete. Mrs. Holt put on a wedding supper in the dining room of the boarding house, chicken and gravy, which Cecil had told Adelaide was the best cooking in town, and she found this was true, and she also found that she was too happy to eat much of it, though she appreciated it fully. They stayed in town that night at the boarding house, and in the morning Cecil's wagon was loaded with Adelaide's things from the back of the shop, the narrow bed and the washstand and the bolt ends of fabric and the battered sewing machine, and they drove 3 miles south out of Harlan Creek in the cool early morning, with the birds going in the brush along the road and the grass still silver with dew. The Underwood Ranch house was larger than she had imagined, 2 proper stories of stone and timber with a wide porch that ran across the front and caught the breeze from the south. It was not elegant, but it was solid and well-maintained and full of the particular evidence of a man who had cared for a place with serious, steady attention. There were curtains in the windows, she noticed, plain and practical, that had clearly been there since before Cecil's management, and she mentally began, without quite deciding to, the long, pleasant project of making the house her own as well as his. Hector Ruiz, the younger of Cecil's 2 ranch hands, a cheerful young man of 21 with a broad smile and the good sense to make himself scarce on the morning after the wedding, had left a pot of coffee on the stove and a note that said, simply, "Welcome, Mrs. Underwood," with a drawing of a small horse beneath it that Adelaide found entirely charming. She stood in the kitchen of the ranch house with her coffee and looked out the window at the grass stretching south and the longhorns moving in the distance, and she thought that this was the strangest and best thing that had happened to her, and she was not sorry for any of the steps that had brought her here. She kept the shop. This had been a condition she had named clearly before the wedding, and Cecil had accepted it not merely as something to be tolerated, but as something he understood was as much a part of her as his ranch was a part of him. She drove the wagon into Harlan Creek 3 days a week, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, and Nancy handled the smaller alterations on the other days under Adelaide's careful supervision. It was a workable arrangement, and it worked. Harlan Creek absorbed the change with the philosophical adaptability of a town that had seen stranger things. Mrs. Underwood, as she was now called by most, was the same as Miss Lockhart had been, only she arrived in the Underwood wagon and wore a garnet ring on her left hand, and sometimes stopped to talk to Cecil when he was at the livery or the hardware store, the two of them standing in the street with the natural ease of people who have made up their minds about each other and feel no need to perform the happiness they are simply living. The autumn was good. The cattle drive in October brought in money that allowed Cecil to pay the last of the old debt against the property, which he told Adelaide about one evening at the supper table, with a quietness that she recognized as the sound of a man releasing a weight he had been carrying for a long time. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand and held hers, and they sat like that for a while in the warm kitchen with the stove going and the sound of the wind in the eaves, and it was, she thought, as good as anything she had ever known. In November, she had reason to go to Galveston. Her father's health had worsened, as she had feared it might, and his letter in October had been shorter than usual and in a handwriting that looked, for the first time, like an old man's. She had known it was coming, and she and Cecil had spoken of it before, and when she told him she needed to go, he said, "I'll take you." "The ranch," she said. "Donal and Hector can manage for 2 weeks," he said. "And I'm not sending you to Galveston alone." He said it simply, as a statement of how things were, and she understood that this was not overprotectiveness but love, the specific, practical form of it that Cecil expressed, the form that showed up and stayed. They went to Galveston by rail from Waco, a journey of several days, and Adelaide's father met them at the station in a way that told her more than any letter had, because he was thinner and leaning on a cane, and his eyes were tired, though they brightened considerably when he saw her. His name was Robert Lockhart, and he was 62, and he was a good man who had done his best in complicated circumstances, and he looked at Cecil Underwood with the careful assessment of a father meeting the man who has married his daughter, and Cecil met it steadily, and with the same respect he gave to anything that mattered. Robert Lockhart said that evening over supper in his house above the print shop, "You are taking proper care of her," Cecil said. "I do my best. She's more than capable of taking care of herself, but I do my best." Robert looked at him for a moment and then nodded once in the way of a man satisfied by an honest answer, and they talked about other things. Adelaide spent 2 weeks reorganizing her father's house, arranging for a neighbor woman to look in on him daily, and sitting with him in the evenings while he told her stories about her mother she had never heard, because he was in the stage of his life where he felt the urgency of telling the things that had never been told. She listened to all of them. She held his hand. She cried once quietly in the kitchen when Cecil found her, and he held her without saying anything because he understood that some things do not benefit from words. When they left Galveston, her father stood on the platform looking smaller than she had ever seen him, and waved with a brightness that cost him effort. And Adelaide waved back and kept her composure until the train was out of the station. And then she put her head on Cecil's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they rode in silence for a long while, watching Texas pass outside the window. Her father lived for 2 more years after that visit, and she returned to Galveston 3 more times during those years, and Cecil came with her twice. When Robert Lockhart died in the winter of 1880, it was peacefully, in his own bed, and the letter that came from his neighbor used the word peacefully, and Adelaide held onto that word with both hands because it was the best possible gift that the situation could offer. She and Cecil went to Galveston for the burial and brought back the few things of her father's that she wanted to keep, his best printing block set and her mother's small portrait in its oval frame, and these things found their place in the ranch house, the printing block on the mantelpiece, and the portrait on the wall of the bedroom where Adelaide saw it every morning. The ranch grew. Cecil had a good eye for cattle and better patience than most men for the work of building something slowly over time without either rushing or giving up, and by 1879 he had expanded the herd to 300 head and taken on a third ranch hand, a young man named Eugene Park who had come up from the hill country with 2 horses and a very good hat, and an earnestness that reminded Adelaide of Hector when he'd first arrived. The shop also grew. Adelaide had, by the end of 1879, taken on enough work that Nancy was working 4 days a week, and Adelaide was considering a second part-time assistant. She had built a clientele that stretched across the county, and twice she had done work for the wife of a cattle baron in Abilene, who had heard of her through a chain of recommendation, so long Adelaide could not fully trace it. She had also begun, cautiously and experimentally, making ready-to-wear pieces, dresses and shirtwaists in the most commonly requested sizes and colors, displayed in the front window, which sold consistently well and with considerably less time investment per piece than custom commissions. She was proud of this. She had made it herself, with her own hands and her own intelligence, and 4 years of learning under a formidable woman in a city far from here. And she felt the satisfaction of it in a way that was deep and specific, and did not require anyone else's acknowledgement, though she was not insensible to the pleasure of Cecil's pride in her, which he expressed characteristically, not with elaborate declarations, but with the way he told people about the shop when it came up in conversation, as though it were a serious and important enterprise, which it was. In the spring of 1880, Adelaide realized she was expecting their first child. She told Cecil on a Sunday morning when they were sitting on the porch in the cool before the day warmed up, both of them with coffee, the particular Sunday quiet of the ranch around them. She said it plainly, as she said most things, and watched his face. He was very still for a moment. Then the warm, brief thing that passed across his face was of a quality she had not seen before on him, something younger and more open, almost undone by it. And then he reached out and took her hand very carefully, as though she had just become something to be guarded, which she found both touching and slightly amusing given that she felt, currently, exactly as capable as she always did. "Adelaide," he said, which was how he began things when he didn't have the words yet. "We'll be fine," she said. "I am strong and healthy and Nancy can handle more of the shop." "I know you're strong," he said. He held her hand and looked at the grass, and she could see him rearranging the world in his head to include this new and large fact. "I know," he said again more quietly. "I'm just—" He stopped. "Scared," she said gently. "A little," he admitted. "My mother died young. I always thought of that as something that happened to women who—" He stopped again. "Cecil," she said, "look at me." He looked at her. "I am not going anywhere," she said. He held her hand tighter, not so tight it hurt. Just tight in the way that said he believed her, and was also very glad she had said it. Their son was born in December of 1880, in the ranch house, with Dr. Crawford in attendance and a leaner Prout, who had appointed herself Adelaide's designated personal support staff for the occasion, providing both practical help and an ongoing commentary on the proceedings that Adelaide was later told had been very entertaining, though at the time she was otherwise occupied. Cecil waited in the parlor because Dr. Crawford was firm on this point in a way that brooked no argument, and Donal Priest sat with him, and Hector, and Eugene, because none of them was going anywhere either, and the house was full of the particular waiting energy of people who love someone and cannot help. When Dr. Crawford opened the parlor door and said, "You have a son and your wife is well," Cecil stood up very fast and had to catch himself on the back of the chair, and Donal said gruffly and quietly, "Go on then," and Cecil went through the door. Adelaide was tired in a way she had not previously known tiredness, a deep and bone-reaching thing, but she was very much herself, and she was holding a small, red-faced, entirely satisfactory person who was making a series of opinions very audibly known. Cecil sat beside her on the edge of the bed with a carefulness that was almost comical in a man of his size, and looked at the baby with an expression so entirely undefended that Adelaide felt tears come to her eyes, which she had not expected, given that she had been managing quite well up to this point. "Hello," Cecil said to the baby, in a low voice that was soft in a way she had heard him be soft with her but never quite like this. The baby blinked at him with the unfocused intensity of the very new and very opinionated. "He's got your eyes," Adelaide said. Cecil looked at her. "My eyes are brown." "I know," she said. "So are his." He looked back at the baby, and the look on his face was not the brief contained warmth she had known for 2 years, but something entirely without containment, open and overwhelming and entirely his. He reached out one large, careful finger, and the baby closed his whole fist around it, which was such a small and ordinary miracle that it filled the room entirely. They named him James Robert Underwood, James for Cecil's father and Robert for Adelaide's, which seemed right, carrying both of them forward. James was a sturdy, serious-faced baby who grew into a sturdy, curious-faced toddler who had his father's determined jaw and his mother's gray eyes, and the combined stubbornness of both of them, which was, everyone agreed, formidable. Hector taught him to say hola before he learned to say hello, which Adelaide considered an excellent development, and Cecil professed mild concern about, though he was clearly not actually concerned. Tom Alvarez, who by 1881 had saved enough to attend school in Waco, and was doing so with impressive results according to his letters home, came back to Harlan Creek for Christmas that year and spent an afternoon at the ranch. And Cecil and Adelaide had him to supper, and James sat on Tom's knee and tried to eat Tom's hat, which Tom permitted with great good humor. Cecil had helped Tom with a letter of recommendation for the school, something Adelaide had learned about from Eleanor Prout rather than Cecil himself, and she had loved him for it in the specific way that you love someone for doing a good thing they said nothing about. The Hartley brothers, who had been a source of genuine concern through the summer of 1878, were apprehended by a U.S. Marshal in the spring of 1879, following a robbery near the border, and were sent to prison in Huntsville. Sheriff Hargrove had, with some assistance from a group of ranchers in the county who had organized themselves around the problem with appropriate seriousness, provided the information that led to their location. Cecil had been part of this organization, something Adelaide had known about and worried over quietly and chosen not to express in terms that would make it harder for him to do what needed doing, which she understood was the particular kind of courage that love sometimes required. The Hartley brothers were gone, and the county was quieter for it, and she allowed herself, after the news came, a full breath of relief. 19 months after James, in the summer of 1882, Adelaide had a second child. A daughter this time, whom they named Clara Adelaide Underwood, and who arrived in the world with considerably more efficiency than her brother had and considerably more hair, a remarkable quantity of auburn hair that everyone immediately recognized as coming straight from her mother. Clara was from her first days different from James in every way that mattered. Where James was deliberate and observed before acting, Clara acted first and considered the results with interest from the landing. She took her first steps at 9 months, said her first sentence at 14 months, and by the time she was 2, had strong and specific opinions about most things and was entirely willing to share them. Adelaide watched her daughter with a recognition that was both tender and a little daunting. She saw herself there, in the set of the small jaw and the directness of the gray eyes and the absolute conviction with which Clara approached the business of existing. She looked at Cecil when Clara was 2 years old, standing in the middle of the parlor explaining to him with considerable authority why she required the specific horse figurine that James had put on the high shelf, and he looked back at Adelaide with an expression that was somewhere between helpless affection and the dawning awareness that he was comprehensively outnumbered, in a way that he had, honestly, brought upon himself. Adelaide loved him for that look more than she could say. The shop by 1883 was genuinely thriving. She had taken on a second assistant, a capable young woman named Frances who had come to Harlan Creek with her family from Missouri and had turned out to have an excellent hand with the finer work and a good eye for fit. Nancy had married one of the schoolteacher's brothers and had moved to a farm outside of town, but she still came in twice a week, and the shop ran with the particular smooth efficiency of a place that has found its rhythm and its people. Adelaide had also begun, in the last 2 years, to do a different kind of work alongside the shop. She had started a small, informal class for women in the area, many of whom were the wives and daughters of Mexican ranching families in the southern part of the county, who had very limited access to sewing instruction, and for whom a well-made dress or a properly fitted piece of clothing was the difference between dignity and the lack of it. She did this on Saturday mornings in the back room of the shop, and she charged nothing for it, because she remembered Mrs. Baughman in San Antonio, and the way that knowledge passed from hand to hand was one of the more reliable goods in a world full of unreliable ones. She was aware, as she did this work, of the particular tensions of the time and place around her. The integration of Mexican families into the broader community of the Texas counties was not simple or smooth, and the injustices that had been done and were continuing to be done to those families by land law and by the casual cruelty of prejudice were real and ongoing, and Adelaide was not naive about her position in relation to them. She was a white woman from the established Anglo community of Harlan Creek, and there were limits to what her classes and her individual respectful behavior could repair in a system that was structured in ways she could not by herself dismantle. But she could do what she could do. She could ensure that the women who came to her shop were treated with complete professional respect regardless of their background. She could make sure the sewing class was a place where everyone's skill was recognized and valued. She could make sure that, when she spoke of these women to others, she spoke of them as individuals of specific dignity and accomplishment rather than as a category. She could make sure her children grew up understanding these things. Cecil was, in this as in most things, her partner. He had grown up understanding that the men who worked his ranch, Hector and Eugene and now young Miguel Ruiz, Hector's cousin, were not lesser people because of their origin, and he treated them accordingly in the way that counted, in wages and in fair dealing and in the basic human courtesy of seeing them. Adelaide and Cecil discussed these things in the evenings at the kitchen table, seriously and without pretense, because they were both people who believed that living honestly in the world required engaging honestly with what the world was. James, at 3 and then 4, was becoming a person with distinct edges, interested in animals with a single-minded passion that suggested he was going to spend his life outdoors, like his father, and interested in words and stories in a way that surprised Adelaide sometimes with its intensity, finding him in corners with the illustrated books she had sent for from San Antonio, staring at the pictures with a focus that was very much her own. Clara, at almost 2, was already organizing things. Rocks primarily. She had a collection of rocks behind the porch that she arranged and rearranged according to a system that was entirely internal and entirely serious, and she corrected anyone who moved them. One evening in the fall of 1883, Cecil came in from the range late, which was not unusual, and sat down at the kitchen table in the way that meant he had something to say. Adelaide put a plate in front of him and sat across from him and waited, because she had learned that the waiting was worth it. "Donald told me today he's thinking about retiring," he said. She looked at him. "When?" "Spring," he said. "He's got a sister in Austin. He's been thinking about going to live near her." Adelaide was quiet for a moment. She understood what this meant to Cecil, who had known Donald Priest his entire life and who had leaned on the older man's knowledge and steadiness in the years when there had been no one else to lean on. "How do you feel about it?" she said. Cecil was quiet for a moment. "I think he's earned it," he said, which was the right answer, and she could tell it had cost something to arrive at it as cleanly as he had. "He has," she said. She reached across the table in the same way she had the night he paid off the last of his debt, and he took her hand in the same way he had then, and they sat together in the warm kitchen while the children slept upstairs and the fire went in the stove and the fall wind moved through the eaves. "I'd like to do something for him," Cecil said, "before he goes." They organized a farewell supper for Donald Priest in the spring of 1884, held in the dining room of Mrs. Holt's boarding house, which was now run by Mrs. Holt's daughter Frances, the original Mrs. Holt having retired and moved to live with her granddaughter in Dallas. Most of the people who mattered in Harlan Creek came, and Adelaide made a new shirt for Donald in a very fine dark gray wool, with buttons that were slightly better than practical, and she gave it to him at the supper with a directness that he met with a dignity that was very much his own. Donald Priest put on the shirt and stood a little straighter and said, "Fine work, Mrs. Underwood," and she understood that coming from him, this was an accolade of the highest order. He shook Cecil's hand at the end of the evening, the two of them standing outside the boarding house in the spring night, and the handshake went on longer than handshakes usually do, neither of them speaking, and Adelaide stood at a respectful distance and watched two people who had known each other all their lives say goodbye with the inadequacy that words always have in such moments. And she understood that this was another thing that love requires, the willingness to stand in the hard places and remain. Donal left for Austin in April, and the ranch felt different without him, not badly different but differently shaped. Cecil managed the adjustment with the same quiet competence he managed everything, and Miguel turned out to have a steadiness that surprised everyone and delighted nobody more than Hector, who had recommended him and who received, in the wake of Miguel's demonstrated reliability, a raise that Cecil gave without being asked. The summer of 1884 was good. The grass was deep and the water held in the creek, and the cattle were healthy, and the ranch, for the first time in Cecil's memory of managing it, felt like something that was thriving rather than merely surviving. He said this to Adelaide one evening on the porch, sitting in the chairs they had put out there for the purpose of sitting in the evenings, James in bed and Clara negotiating her way toward sleep through the application of several more demands from upstairs. "I want to tell you something," Cecil said. Adelaide looked at him. The evening was soft and the fireflies were beginning to come up in the grass. "I want to tell you what this has been," he said. He stopped because finding words for the interior of himself was still the hardest work he did. "What you have been," he looked at her. "I know I don't say things the way other men do. I know I'm not particularly poetic about it." "Cecil," she said gently, "I just want you to know," he said, "that there is no part of this, not the ranch, not the children, not any morning of the last 6 years that I would trade or change. Not any of it." She looked at him in the summer evening, this man who had walked into her shop with an armload of shirts he did not need mended, who had stood in doorways being a boulder, who had held her hand across a counter and put his mother's garnet ring on her finger, who had sat with her through grief and driven her to Galveston and waited in the parlor while she became a mother, who was right now searching for words for a thing that had no adequate words and offering her the honest attempt. "Cecil," she said. She stood up from her chair and crossed the porch and sat beside him in the larger chair that barely held both of them, which she had done before, and which required a degree of arrangement that he accommodated by putting his arm around her, which was, she thought, the exact right place for it to be. "I know," she said. "I know exactly what you mean." He pulled her in closer, and they sat on the porch in the summer evening in the warm air, and the fireflies came up in the grass, and the sky went dark overhead, and the stars came out over the Texas plains in the enormous, generous way they do when there is nothing between you and them. From upstairs, Clara's voice came down with one more request, something to do with the horse figurine again, and Cecil turned his face into Adelaide's hair and laughed, the real laugh she had first heard in the shop the day Roland Vickers left, and she laughed with him, and the evening went on warm and good around them. By the autumn of 1885, James was nearly 5 and had become deeply interested in the process of branding, specifically in whether there was a way to make it more efficient, which was a question he had posed to Cecil with such seriousness that Cecil had spent an entire supper discussing it with him as a genuine intellectual problem. Adelaide had sat across the table watching them and felt something so full it was difficult to contain. The sight of her husband and her son with their matching brows and their matched deliberateness working through a problem together in the lamplight. Clara was 3½ and had added lizards to her rock collection, which she was now calling her scientific collection, a word she had heard Adelaide use in another context and adopted with full confidence. Eugene had taught her to count to 20 in Spanish as well as in English, which she demonstrated to anyone who would hold still long enough. The shop remained the shop, Adelaide's, the card in the window still reading Adelaide Lockhart, Seamstress and Alterations, because the name was the one she had put up when she arrived, and it was the name the shop had built its reputation on. And the garnet ring on her left hand, and the children and the ranch made clear enough to anyone who needed to know it the rest of the story. Frances had turned into a genuinely skilled seamstress in her own right, and there were days when Adelaide watched her work and felt the satisfaction of the teacher as well as the business owner. The sewing class continued, and in the fall of 1885, Adelaide had a small but real moment of particular satisfaction when one of the women from the class, a young woman named Rosaria who had been coming for 2 years, opened her own small alteration service from the room at the front of her family's house in the southern part of town. Adelaide went to see it on its first day and shook Rosaria's hand and told her it was excellent work and meant it entirely. One Friday in November, Cecil came into the shop at the end of the afternoon, which he did occasionally when he was in town late, to drive Adelaide home in the wagon. She was finishing up the last of the day's work, a hem on a wool skirt for the new schoolteacher's wife, and he waited in the customer chair, which he occupied in the manner of a man who has filled that chair a great many times over the years and has made his peace with it. Adelaide looked at him sitting there in the warm afternoon light of the shop, the same shop where he had first come in with his armload of shirts, where he had stood on one side of the counter and she on the other, and they had found their way to each other across the particular distance of 2 people, discovering that the world is less lonely than it was. He was 35 now, and the years had settled further into his face without diminishing it, and he wore the same brown eyes and the same contained warmth and the same quality of being entirely, unambiguously present. He caught her looking. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. She tied off the last stitch and snipped the thread. "I was just thinking." "About what?" She folded the skirt and set it on the counter. "About shirts," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then the corner of his mouth moved in the way she loved, the slow, private, undefended smile that was hers and no one else's. "I seem to recall those were in generally fine condition," he said. "Several of them," she agreed. "Several were in perfect condition. I was," he said, "working with limited resources." "You were," she said, "very transparent." He stood up from the chair and crossed to the counter and stood on the other side of it, exactly as he had stood the first day, and looked at her with the brown eyes that held everything she had come to know about him, the steadiness and the warmth and the long, considered love that had shown up in a seamstress's shop in a small Texas town and simply refused to leave. "Adelaide," he said. "Yes," she said, the same way she had said it the afternoon he asked her to be his wife, simple and sure and meaning everything. He reached across the counter and took her hand, and she gave it to him, and the garnet ring caught the last light through the window, and the shop was warm and familiar around them, and outside Harlan Creek went about its end-of-Friday business with the cheerful indifference of a town that had absorbed the story of Cecil Underwood and Adelaide Lockhart and made it simply part of itself, the way all good stories become, eventually, the furniture of a place. They drove home in the wagon in the November dusk, the road south out of town well known under the wheels and the horses, the land familiar and beloved on either side. Adelaide had her hand through Cecil's arm and the blanket across their laps against the cold coming in off the grass. The stars were beginning. "Donal wrote," Cecil said. "He's well in Austin. His sister has a garden." "I'm glad," Adelaide said. "Tom Alvarez wrote too. He's been offered a position teaching at the school in Waco." "Cecil," she said, "that's wonderful." "I thought you'd like that," he said. There was real pleasure in his voice. They came up the drive to the ranch house, and the lights were on downstairs where Hector's wife, Lucia, who had been minding the children this afternoon, had lit the lamps. James could be seen through the window at the kitchen table, very likely drawing animals or working on his efficiency problem. Clara was audible from the porch, explaining something to someone, possibly a lizard. Cecil helped Adelaide down from the wagon, and they stood for a moment in the cold dark outside the lit house, the sound of their children inside it, the land stretching out around them in the enormous, patient Texas way. "I have been thinking," Cecil said, with the measured tone of a man who has been thinking for some time and is now ready to produce the conclusion. "Tell me," she said. "We have been talking about expanding the north pasture," he said, "which we have. And about the new cattle shed which is underway." He paused. "But I have also been thinking about the porch." She looked at the porch. "What about the porch?" "It needs a swing," he said. "I've been thinking this for a while, for sitting in the evenings." She looked at him. He was entirely serious in the way that he was serious about calving and water rights and cattle prices, and apparently also porch swings. "A swing," she said. "For the evenings," he said. "When the children are settled and it's warm enough." She thought about the evenings on the porch, the summer fireflies, the stars, the two of them in the one large chair. She thought about a swing wide enough for both of them in the warm months and quiet months and cold months, moving gently in the evening air. "Cecil Underwood," she said, "that is an excellent idea." He built it the following Saturday, with James helping in the earnest, inefficient, entirely wonderful way of a nearly 5-year-old boy who understands that he is participating in something real. Clara supervised from the porch railing with specific opinions about the positioning that turned out, when considered, to be geometrically sound. When it was done, Cecil and Adelaide sat in it in the late Saturday afternoon, testing its engineering, James climbing on the armrest and Clara installed between them with the absolute certainty of a child who has never doubted her welcome. The swing moved gently. The grass was winter brown, and the sky was the particular clear blue of a Texas November day, high and bright and very far. Adelaide leaned her head on Cecil's shoulder and thought about a Tuesday in April 1878, a wagon pulling up in front of an empty shop, a sign being hung, a practical woman in a bonnet with quick hands and a plan, and no illusions about how difficult the next few months would be. She had been right that it would be difficult. She had not known, could not have known, that it would also be this particular, specific, irreplaceable life. Cecil's hand found hers on the seat of the swing between them and held it, warm and steady as he had always been, as she understood he would always be, and the swing moved in the November afternoon, and the children talked, and the ranch went on around them, everything in its place, everything complete, everything theirs. And the garnet ring on her finger caught the winter light, and the shop on Main Street would open again on Tuesday, and the grass would green again in the spring, and James would grow and Clara would grow, and the years would come and be good. And Adelaide Lockhart Underwood sat on her porch swing in the Texas November with her hand in her husband's hand and her children beside her, and knew, with the full, grounded certainty of a woman who had built her life with her own hands and her own heart, that she was exactly where she was meant to be.